The biggest mistake a CEO can make is firing the man who built her success without knowing his name. The engine had defeated 3 senior engineers in 12 days. It sat silent in the center of Vance Motorsport's main workshop beneath rows of white lights and polished steel beams, a machine worth millions of dollars that refused to come alive. The national championship race was only 72 hours away. Sponsors were calling every hour. Investors wanted answers. Nobody had one. Then Mason Walker fixed it. He wasn't assigned to the project. He wasn't even supposed to touch it. Officially, he was a maintenance mechanic working the lower level of the facility, a quiet single father whose name rarely appeared in meetings and never appeared in company reports. Yet sometime after midnight, while most of the engineering department had gone home frustrated, Mason pulled a stool beside the disabled race car and spent 8 hours alone with the machine. By sunrise, the engine started on the first attempt. The sound rolled through the building like distant thunder. Mechanics stopped what they were doing. Engineers looked up from their workstations. For a few brief moments, hope returned to the workshop. At 8:17 a.m., CEO Evelyn Vance walked through the doors. 29 years old, sharp, disciplined, and carrying the weight of a company her late father had spent 3 decades building, she had little patience for employees who ignored procedure. She listened as the chief engineer explained that the engine had somehow been repaired overnight. Then she learned who had done it. Her expression hardened immediately. Mason stood quietly in front of her office less than 10 minutes later. He did not sit. He did not defend himself. Evelyn held the maintenance report in one hand and the disciplinary policy in the other. Unauthorized interference with company property. Violation of engineering protocol. Direct disregard for chain of command. The words came one after another. Mason listened without interruption. Outside the glass walls, employees slowed their pace just enough to watch. Nobody spoke. Nobody stepped in. Finally, Evelyn slid a termination form across the desk. "You're done here, Mr. Walker." Mason looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he signed it. No argument. No anger. No explanation. He collected his worn canvas jacket from the chair beside the door and walked out of the office. The workshop remained silent as he crossed the floor. Some looked away. Others watched him leave. Near the service entrance, Cameron Reed, the company's chief operating officer, stared after him with an expression nobody could quite read. The door closed behind Mason. A few seconds later, Cameron quietly exhaled and said words that nobody in the room would forget. "She just fired the wrong man." Mason drove home in silence. The old pickup moved steadily through late morning traffic while the termination papers rested untouched on the passenger seat beside him. He did not look at them once. Outside the windshield, the city continued as if nothing had happened. Construction crews worked behind orange barriers. Delivery trucks rolled through intersections. People hurried into office buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases. None of them knew that one signature that morning had changed the direction of an entire company. Mason reached the small apartment complex shortly before noon. The building was older than most of the developments around it, clean but worn by time. He parked in his usual spot and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The apartment door opened before he reached for his keys. Luna stood there holding a stuffed rabbit with one missing button eye. She smiled the moment she saw him. "You are home early," she said. Mason nodded. "Looks that way." She studied him for a second. Children often notice things adults missed. Did something bad happen? Mason took off his jacket and hung it beside the door. "Just a long day." Luna seemed satisfied with that answer. She returned to the kitchen table where colored pencils were spread across several sheets of paper. Mason stepped into the small kitchen and began preparing lunch. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scratch of colored pencils across paper. On the wall above the table hung no awards, no photographs from race tracks, no framed certificates. Anyone entering the apartment would have assumed it belonged to an ordinary mechanic raising his daughter alone. That assumption had followed Mason for years. Across town, Cameron Reed stood inside his office staring through a glass wall toward the engineering building. The workshop remained tense. Engineers moved between stations. Managers checked schedules. Yet something felt different now. He opened an old digital archive and typed a name into the search field. The system immediately requested executive authorization. Cameron stared at the screen for several seconds before closing it again. Meanwhile, in the executive wing, Evelyn Vance sat alone reviewing reports connected to the race program. She expected to feel relief after enforcing company policy. Instead, Cameron's words continued repeating in her mind. She just fired the wrong man. The statement made no sense. Mason Walker was a maintenance mechanic. Nothing more. At least that was what his employee file said. Yet something about Cameron's reaction bothered her. She opened Mason's personnel record and frowned. The file seemed unusually thin. Employment history. Standard certifications. Routine evaluations. Nothing remarkable. And yet several sections appeared restricted. Evelyn leaned back slowly. Employees at Mason's level did not have restricted files. For the first time that day, a small question appeared in her mind. Who exactly had she fired? The following morning began before sunrise. Mason was already awake when the first pale light reached the apartment window. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee while Luna slept in the next room. In front of him rested a small metal box no larger than a toolbox. The paint had faded years ago. The corners showed scratches from countless moves and storage rooms. Most people would have seen an old container and nothing more. Mason opened it briefly, looked inside, then closed it again without removing a single item. A few minutes later he stood, prepared breakfast, and moved on with the morning as if nothing unusual had happened. Across town, Evelyn arrived at headquarters earlier than normal. The building was quiet. Most employees had not yet arrived. She carried a tablet under one arm and walked directly toward the executive archives located on the top floor. Her thoughts remained fixed on the restricted sections inside Mason's file. By company policy, only senior executives, founders, and certain classified engineering personnel received that level of clearance. Maintenance mechanics certainly did not. The archive manager looked surprised when she requested access. "You are looking for historical engineering records?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "Anything connected to Mason Walker?" The manager entered the request. A moment later his expression changed slightly. "There are records," he said. "A lot more than I expected." Evelyn frowned. 20 minutes later she sat alone inside a private review room. Digital folders filled the screen. Most were locked. Some dated back nearly a decade. Others carried authorization codes from her father himself. She opened the oldest accessible document. It was not a disciplinary report. It was not a maintenance record. It was a personal letter written by Richard Vance. Her father's signature appeared at the bottom. Evelyn felt her pulse slow. The first sentence immediately caught her attention. "Mason Walker remains the most gifted engineering mind I have encountered in my career." She read the line twice. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Meanwhile, Cameron Reed entered the main engineering facility and found tension waiting for him. Engineers surrounded diagnostic stations. Managers moved quickly between offices. The race vehicle repaired 2 days earlier had failed another systems check during early testing. Nobody understood why. One engineer claimed it was a software issue. Another blamed a sensor array. A third suggested replacing half the control architecture. Cameron listened without speaking. Finally he looked toward the silent car resting beneath the overhead lights. Then he asked a simple question. Has anyone looked at Mason's original notes? The room became still. Several engineers exchanged confused glances. One finally answered. What original notes? Cameron stared at them for a long moment before looking away. For the first time, genuine concern appeared in his eyes. Because if they did not even know those notes existed, the problem facing the company was far larger than a broken race car. The next 48 hours changed the atmosphere inside Vance Motorsport. What had started as a routine preparation cycle for the championship race slowly turned into something else. Engineers stopped speaking with confidence. Managers stopped making promises. Every new diagnostic report seemed to create 2 additional questions. The race vehicle continued failing tests in ways nobody could fully explain. One moment the systems appeared stable. The next, critical performance readings drifted outside acceptable limits. Entire teams worked through the night searching for answers. None appeared. Evelyn spent most of Thursday moving between meetings, engineering briefings, and sponsor calls. Every conversation ended the same way. Someone assured her progress was being made. Then someone else admitted they were not actually certain what the problem was. By late afternoon, frustration had begun replacing confidence. She returned to the archive room and opened another folder connected to Mason Walker. This time the document was an internal engineering review written nearly 9 years earlier. The report evaluated several prototype race platforms that had eventually become the foundation of the company's championship program. One name appeared repeatedly throughout hundreds of pages. Mason Walker. LED concept architecture. Mason Walker. Systems integration. Mason Walker. Performance validation. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen. The deeper she looked, the stranger everything became. Officially, the company history credited multiple senior engineers for those achievements. Yet document after document pointed toward the same individual. Meanwhile, Cameron walked through the engineering floor carrying an old storage key he had not touched in years. The key opened a secure archive room located beneath the original workshop built by Richard Vance decades earlier. Dust covered most of the shelves. Obsolete equipment sat forgotten in corners. Cameron moved directly toward a locked metal cabinet and opened it. Inside rested dozens of binders filled with handwritten notes. Detailed sketches. Calculations. Test observations. Design revisions. Every page carried the same signature. Mason Walker. Cameron removed one binder and opened it carefully. Several nearby engineers gathered around him. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. One younger engineer looked up and asked quietly, "Who exactly was this guy?" Cameron studied the pages before answering. "The reason half this company exists." That evening Mason sat on a folding chair beside a community soccer field while Luna participated in practice with children her age. The sun hung low over the horizon. Parents watched from the sidelines. Coaches organized drills. It was an ordinary evening. Luna eventually ran over carrying a water bottle and sat beside him. "You seem quieter than normal," she said. Mason smiled faintly. "Do I?" She nodded. Then she pointed toward the sky where a passenger jet crossed above the field. "Do people ever forget who built things?" The question seemed random. Children often asked questions that appeared disconnected from everything around them. Mason looked at the distant airplane for a moment before answering. "Sometimes they do." Luna considered that. "But the thing they built still remembers." Mason looked at her. For the first time all day, he did not have an answer. Friday morning arrived with a level of tension that nobody inside Vance Motorsport could ignore anymore. The championship race was now less than 24 hours away. What had once looked like a routine path toward another successful season had become a growing crisis. Engineers crowded around diagnostic displays. Conference rooms remained occupied from sunrise onward. Coffee cups accumulated beside keyboards faster than they could be thrown away. Yet despite hundreds of hours of effort, the same problem continued returning. The race vehicle would pass one test and fail the next. No pattern appeared consistent. No explanation survived scrutiny. Evelyn stood inside the main engineering bay watching another systems review unfold. The lead engineers debated theories with increasing urgency. One blamed a calibration conflict. Another suspected hidden software corruption. A third proposed replacing major hardware components entirely. Each suggestion sounded reasonable until it was tested. Then the problem returned. Cameron listened quietly from the back of the room. Finally he stepped forward and placed one of Mason's old binders onto the conference table. The room immediately became silent. Several engineers recognized the binder from the archive room. Cameron opened it to a page covered with handwritten notes and detailed diagrams. "Look at the margin comments," he said. The engineers leaned closer. Every page contained observations written in precise handwriting. Not only explanations of how the systems worked but explanations of why they had been designed that way in the first place. One engineer slowly shook his head. "Nobody writes documentation like this anymore." Another turned several pages forward. Then another. His expression changed. "Wait." He pointed toward a note buried inside a corner of the design review. The note described a rare performance instability connected to a specific operating condition. The symptoms matched exactly what they had been fighting for 2 days. The room fell completely still. The note had been written nearly 8 years earlier. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained frozen in place. The realization settled heavily. Mason had predicted the problem long before the vehicle itself even existed. Across town, Mason spent the afternoon helping Luna build a small model airplane at the kitchen table. The pieces were scattered across newspapers while sunlight entered through the apartment window. Luna concentrated carefully as she attached one wing. "How do you know where every piece belongs?" she asked. Mason examined the instruction sheet. "Because somebody thought about the whole design before they built it." Luna nodded thoughtfully. "So if something breaks, the person who designed it usually knows why?" Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Usually." At headquarters, Evelyn stared at another newly opened archive file. This one contained a private memo written by her father shortly before his death. She read the first line once. Then again. By the third reading, her hands had gone completely still. Richard Vance had written only 11 words. "If Mason Walker ever leaves, the company will forget itself." Saturday morning arrived beneath gray clouds and growing pressure. The championship race would begin the following day. Inside Vance Motorsport, nobody was talking about victory anymore. They were talking about survival. Engineers continued working through Mason's binders page by page. What began as a search for technical solutions slowly became something else. Every document revealed another layer of understanding nobody realized had existed. Design decisions that seemed random suddenly made sense. Systems everyone believed had been created by committees traced back to a single source. Notes written years earlier described problems that had not even happened yet. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the truth became. Shortly after noon, Evelyn called an emergency executive meeting. Senior managers filled the conference room. The atmosphere felt different from every meeting she had led before. This time nobody arrived with confidence. Cameron placed several binders on the table. Nobody touched them at first. Finally, one board member looked toward him. "How much of this program came from Walker?" Cameron answered without hesitation. "Almost all of it." Silence followed. Another executive frowned. "You are telling me one maintenance mechanic designed the foundation of our race division?" Cameron slowly shook his head. "No. I am telling you that a maintenance mechanic did not design it. Mason Walker did." The distinction landed heavily across the room. Evelyn remained quiet. For 2 days she had been uncovering pieces of the same story. Now the picture was finally becoming impossible to ignore. Richard Vance had not simply respected Mason. He had trusted him. Again and again, internal correspondence described Mason as the person who understood the complete architecture of the company better than anyone else. Yet somehow, over the years, his role had faded from public view. Promotions passed him by. Credit shifted elsewhere. New employees arrived without ever learning his history. The company kept benefiting from his work while gradually forgetting the man himself. Across town, Mason and Luna spent the afternoon at a small public library. Luna sat cross-legged beside a shelf reading a book about aircraft engineering while Mason reviewed a notebook at a nearby table. The notebook contained no company documents. No race plans. No designs. Only simple sketches and ideas he had collected over the years. Luna eventually walked over carrying her book. "Did you ever build something people forgot about?" she asked. Mason closed the notebook. "Sometimes." She looked down thoughtfully. "Does that make you sad?" Mason considered the question longer than expected. "Not if the thing still helps people." Back at headquarters, an engineer burst into Cameron's office carrying one of the recovered binders. His face showed equal parts excitement and disbelief. He opened to a marked page and pointed toward a handwritten note buried between calculations. Cameron read it once. Then he immediately stood up. Because 8 years earlier, Mason had not only predicted the failure threatening the race vehicle. He had already written the exact solution. The discovery spread through headquarters faster than any official announcement. Engineers passed copies of the handwritten page from desk to desk. Managers who had never spoken Mason's name before now stood in small groups discussing him in lowered voices. The solution outlined in the binder was precise, detailed, and written years before the race vehicle itself had been completed. By early evening, the engineering team implemented the correction exactly as described. For the first time in days, the system reading stabilized. Performance metrics returned to expected ranges. Diagnostic warnings disappeared. Nobody celebrated. The improvement only deepened the question hanging over the company. How had one man seen all of this coming so far in advance? Evelyn remained in her office long after most employees had gone home. The championship race was less than 12 hours away. Yet her attention was no longer focused on the vehicle. It was focused on a sealed folder resting on her desk. The folder had been stored separately from the other archives. It contained materials her father had marked for executive review only. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were letters, project notes, and private correspondence spanning more than a decade. She began reading. With every page, another piece of the story emerged. Mason had not joined the company after its success. He had helped create that success. Some of the earliest championship concepts carried his technical fingerprints. Several breakthrough designs originated from his research. Internal discussions repeatedly showed senior executives seeking his opinion before major engineering decisions. Yet whenever recognition appeared possible, Mason seemed to step aside. Promotions were declined. Public appearances were avoided. Credit was redirected elsewhere. Richard Vance had written extensively about it. In one letter he described Mason as the rarest kind of builder. A man more interested in solving problems than being known for solving them. Evelyn closed the folder and stared through the office window into the dark parking lot below. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she felt genuinely uncertain about her own judgment. Across town, Mason and Luna sat on the small apartment balcony watching city lights flicker in the distance. Luna held her stuffed rabbit while eating a bowl of ice cream. The evening air carried the cool feeling of approaching autumn. "Did you ever work with someone important?" she asked suddenly. Mason smiled faintly. "A few people." Luna nodded as though that answer confirmed something she already suspected. "I think they miss you." Mason looked toward the horizon. He did not answer immediately. Before he could speak, his phone vibrated for the first time in days. The screen illuminated in the darkness. One message appeared. It came from Cameron Reed. There were only 6 words. "We finally found your original files." Mason read the message once. Then he quietly placed the phone back into his pocket. Hundreds of miles away from the racetrack, surrounded by nothing more than a small apartment and a quiet evening with his daughter, he suddenly understood that the company had finally begun remembering who built it. Race day arrived beneath a clear morning sky and an atmosphere that felt heavier than anyone expected. Thousands of spectators filled the grandstands. Sponsors occupied private suites overlooking the track. Reporters moved through the paddock searching for stories. To everyone outside the company, Vance Motorsport appeared calm and prepared. Inside the organization, the reality was very different. The vehicle was operational, but confidence remained fragile. Too many questions had surfaced during the previous week. Too many assumptions had collapsed. Engineers monitored every system reading with unusual intensity. Evelyn stood beside the control center watching data stream across multiple displays. The car was scheduled to begin final pre-race procedures within the hour. Then another warning appeared. A single indicator flashed red. One engineer leaned forward. Another immediately checked supporting systems. Within moments the room became silent. The instability had returned. Not as severe as before, but enough to threaten performance under race conditions. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally one senior engineer looked up. "We can run it," he said carefully. "But I cannot guarantee what happens after 50 laps." The statement landed like a weight across the room. Sponsors had already arrived. Media coverage had begun. Withdrawal from the race would become a public disaster. Continuing carried its own risks. Cameron stared at the diagnostics before turning toward Evelyn. Neither needed to say what both were thinking. Every path seemed to lead back to the same person. Across town, Mason and Luna were spending the morning at a small science museum. Luna moved excitedly between exhibits while Mason followed a few steps behind carrying her backpack. The world felt remarkably normal compared to the chaos unfolding elsewhere. At one display, Luna stopped beside a model engine mounted behind glass. She studied it for a long moment. "People build amazing things," she said. Mason nodded. "Sometimes they do." She pointed toward a plaque beneath the display. "This one has the builder's name on it." Mason looked at the plaque and smiled faintly. Before he could answer, his phone vibrated again. This time it was not a message. It was a call. Evelyn Vance. Mason stared at the screen without moving. The call continued ringing. Luna looked up. "Are you going to answer?" she asked. Mason remained silent for a moment. Then he pressed decline and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Hundreds of miles away at the race facility, Evelyn lowered her phone slowly. Around her, executives, engineers, and sponsors waited for direction. For the first time, nobody was looking toward the chief executive officer for answers. They were all looking toward the empty space left behind by the man who had quietly carried those answers for years. And for the first time since firing him, Evelyn fully understood the difference. The call ended without another attempt. Evelyn stood silently beside the control center while the race clock continued moving toward the start. Around her, engineers monitored systems that nobody fully trusted. Sponsors exchanged concerned looks. Executives avoided eye contact. The company had spent years believing its greatest asset was technology. Now everyone understood the truth. Their greatest asset had always been a person. Cameron stepped beside Evelyn and handed her a thin folder recovered from Richard Vance's private archive. She opened it immediately. Inside was a final handwritten note from her father. The message was short. If the day ever comes when everyone forgets Mason Walker, pay attention to what happens next. The company will remind you. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. Then she made a decision. 1 hour later, a black company vehicle pulled into the parking lot of the Science Museum. Mason and Luna were walking toward the exit when Evelyn stepped out alone. No executives. No lawyers. No cameras. Just the two people whose lives had crossed at exactly the wrong moment. Luna looked up at Mason. "That is the lady from your work." Mason nodded. Evelyn approached slowly. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally she stopped a few feet away. "I came to apologize." Mason remained quiet. She continued. "I thought I was protecting the company. I was trying to prove I could lead it. Instead, I fired the person who understood it better than anyone." The words sounded simple. Honest. Not rehearsed. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked only one question. "Did you find the archives?" Evelyn nodded. "All of them." Mason glanced toward Luna before looking back. "Then you already have what you need." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. "We have the notes. We have the designs. We have the history. But that is not the same thing." Silence settled between them. Nearby, families crossed the parking lot carrying souvenirs and photographs. The world continued normally around a conversation that would quietly change an entire company. Finally Mason agreed to visit the race facility. Not as an employee. Not as a consultant. Simply as the person who knew the machine best. Several hours later, he stood inside the engineering bay once again. The room fell silent the moment he entered. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. Nobody looked away. Engineers stepped aside. Executives stood. Even veteran managers seemed unsure what to say. Mason reviewed the system reports, made several observations, and calmly directed a series of adjustments. Less than 30 minutes later, the final warning indicators disappeared. The race vehicle operated exactly as intended. No celebration followed. The silence was more powerful than applause. As Mason prepared to leave, Luna walked beside him holding her stuffed rabbit. She looked around the room full of engineers, managers, and executives staring at her father. Then she asked the question nobody else could. "Daddy, why are they all looking at you?" Mason smiled faintly and took her hand. Before he could answer, Cameron spoke from across the room. "Because they finally remembered who built this place." No one disagreed.